So hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Anna Agarat. I'm the Director of Programs and Partnerships at AMPT Advancing Nonprofits. Really grateful to be here in partnership with Greater Auburn Gresham Development Corporation and also our dear friend Dana Brito from Cultivar Consulting, who will be leading us in a session this morning. It's really a follow-up, a part two of budgets, digging a little bit deeper into cash flow. And so we hope that today you will stay comfortable with us and engaged. Feel free to continue refreshing yourselves in the way that makes most sense. And we will encourage you to come on camera if you feel so called, but let us know if you're there or not in the chat as well, so we know whether or not we can call on you. And feel free to raise your hand and use the mic to come off and ask questions. So for those of you who are not familiar with AMPT, we are here committed to strengthening organizational health and to support the long-term development of small nonprofit organizations in Chicago. We prioritize Black and Latina communities, and we are also working to transform philanthropy, and we hope to serve as a model for anti-racist systems, practices, and processes. We are looking forward to significant and sustained investment in Chicago's Black and Latina communities. And so thank you for joining us today so that we can be a part of doing that together. So we're here to build capacity of Black and Latina-led organizations, south and west side of the communities, also organizations whose budgets are less than $2 million. We want to amplify your work, and we prioritize developmental relationships. And what that means is we really look forward to seeing you grow and growing with you. And so I'm going to pass it over to Dana. Please introduce yourself and let us know what we're in for today.
Oh, thank you so much, Anna. Welcome. I'm thrilled to be back with you all. I think I recognize at least one familiar face from last session. But again, for those of you who didn't get a chance to join us for the part one of this, my name is Dana Brito. I've been working with and for nonprofits for pretty much my entire career, and I've been doing that work mostly in the finance and operations space. So I started as a lender, then moved into consulting and advisory work, which is what I'm doing right now, and also serve as a board member and board treasurer for two organizations here in Chicago and in Detroit. So in my work, again, I really focus on providing training, coaching, and more traditional consulting engagements that are really focused on using finance as a tool for empowerment, but also as a tool for strategic effectiveness. And I very much understand that finance can and often is and has to be an exercise in administrative and compliance drudgery, but I also think that finance can be an opportunity to build what you want to build and make sure you have the resources and tools to execute the vision, dreams, and impact that you want to see in your community. So that approach, I think you'll probably see in here, especially today, because we're talking a lot about budgeting and using numbers to plan for the future. And that's again, an approach that informs a lot of the work that I do within the context of the partnership with AMP, but also outside of that as well. So I'm hoping, again, I know it's a busy time of year, really happy to have you all here, but hopefully we can see that, if this can be an extension of my way to help make finance not necessarily fun, but sort of highlight how it can be really critical and useful in achieving the impact that you set out to achieve as the organizations that you represent. So for today, again, the title of today's session was Managing Budgets Part 2. In the next slide, I'll do a very quick recap of what we covered in our first session. But for today, we're going to be focusing on other aspects of budgeting outside of your standard annual operating budget. So a big piece of today, and probably the first half of our time together, really just going to be talking about cash flow management. So the exercise of actually projecting cash flow over a 12-year basis, or it could be even further out if you wanted to, and really some strategies for actually managing the ins and outs of cash. Then we're going to move into and revisit some of the concepts we introduced last session around really being active around how you're monitoring your budget, your overall organizational budget once it's passed, and making sure you're revisiting it throughout the year. And then understanding the points at which you may need to reforecast that original budget. And sort of we'll talk about sort of the criteria for that and the process around that for sure. And then we'll go into these two, at 2.20 elements of budgeting. Really, so thinking about scenario planning and context under which and circumstances under which that may be actually super useful for you as an organization. And then this concept of multi-year budgeting. So what is it? How does it differ from annual budgeting that you do as an organization? And the circumstances under which that type of budgeting can be most impactful and useful for you as an organization. So before we move into the content for today, just wanted to ground us and remind us of some of the concepts that we talked about in the last session that I did with you all, or with this the similar group back in September. So we talked really more and focused more on your annual operating budget and the process around that. So we started with a lot of discussion around making sure you're built, before you start, putting numbers to spreadsheets, building out a process that is reasonably inclusive and also sort of backs into the deadlines that you have with your board, leaving enough time for iterations of budgets, clearly defining roles across your budgeting team. So program directors might have a little bit more input and responsibility over expenses, while those who are overseeing any fundraising or development efforts might have more oversight and responsibility over revenue. So being very clear about who across the team is doing what related to the budget, and ensuring that, again, moving towards a process that's a little bit more inclusive, because again, it takes the strategic burden off of you. It also opens that up to your staff and your board to be strategic thought partners with you. And it also helps sort of build your bench of leaders across your managers and program heads, especially, and giving them a chance to understand the financial impact of the decisions that they make. Then we shifted into a lot of discussion around what is this concept of full costs. So not just focusing on the direct costs tied to your program and operations delivery, but also those costs that are indirect and often shared across programs. So like management salaries, rent, utilities, and making sure you're budgeting for both, and a little bit of talk around how to think about allocating those across programs to make sure you're capturing the full cost of what it actually takes to deliver a program. And then we shifted to the revenue side of budgeting, and sort of balancing what you know now and what's happened in the past with new realities that are happening either now or in the near future. And then also using this concept called probability analysis, where you're basically attaching likelihoods to each of the sources of revenue that you're projecting. And those that are either already confirmed, you can, apply 100% probability and budget those for 100%, while those who are the sources that for which you don't have as much of a history or experience generating might want to consider being a little bit more conservative in terms of those amounts. So really just a way of managing risk as it relates to revenue, and really, again, balancing the historical knowledge and experiences with the new realities, and being clear about things like, during COVID, a lot of rapid response money that you may have received then may not be available now. And sort of, again, so balancing history with current realities. And then again, we talked a lot about this towards the end of last session, and we'll be talking about it even more today. Sort of what does it look like to actually monitor your budget, and think about this concept of reforecasting. So we only slightly touched on that last time. We'll spend a lot more time talking about that today, along with that concept of scenario planning that I talked about before. So shifting into cash flow. So I think if you think about sort of the order of progression as it relates to budgeting, so you have your annual operating budget, you're going through that process, it goes to your board or whoever your approving body or entities are. They pass it, and then sort of, okay, what happens from there? along with ideally uploading that budget to your accounting system, and I'll talk about the benefits of that later. Along with that step, ideally, that's your chance, if you're not already doing it or haven't already done it, to map out what the budget looks like in terms of cash coming in and cash going out throughout the year. So you can think about your budget, your overall budget that you pass with your board, as that's how we're going to make and spend our money. Cash flow projections that therefore are an accompanying exercise and document that shows actually when that money is going to come in and when you're going to have to expend that money to vendors, lenders, what have you. And so doing that exercise again, especially at the beginning of the year and then revisiting it throughout the year, is super critical, especially if you are in a position where cash is tight, or if you're dealing with uncertainty around maybe specific reimbursements of government contracts or uncertainty around a specific grant. Really critical to make sure that you know and have some sense of what the cash flow picture is going to look like. And especially important to identify shortages or potential shortages as quickly and as early in the process as possible, so that you're avoiding late fees, you're ensuring that you can pay staff, you're ensuring that you can, provide the resources and supplies necessary to serve your community and constituents, and make sure that you're also not jeopardizing any relationships with important vendors, which could happen, especially if you're not able to meet the expected or scheduled payment schedule with those vendors. So the budget's again more the how you're going to make and spend money. The cash flow is more the when. It's answering the when of when it's going to come in and when you're going to have to expend those resources. So in developing cash flow, projections, I think it's really important to think about the frequency in which you are going to be revisiting them, for sure. There are organizations, I think there's like a standard, I'll call it best practice, where you're thinking and looking at it every month and making adjustments as needed. There are, situations where organizations, especially in very cash strapped times, are looking at it every week, sometimes more frequently. But when you're projecting out cash flow and looking at it on a monthly basis, and sort of like for the next 12 months, this is what our cash flow picture is looking like. Ideally, at a monthly basis, you're just sort of seeing what the projections look like, what actually happened, and updating those as needed. But again, what your cash situation looks like will very often dictate how often you have to be revisiting those projections. I think with projecting cash flow, it's really important to think about seasonality, especially. So on the expense side, there's probably certain expenses like payroll that are pretty consistent every month. So you could take that expense that's in your budget, divide that by 12, and that's sort of the monthly anticipated expenditure. But if you have things like either special events or fundraising events, or certain programmatic events for which you are incurring a bunch of expenses, you want to make sure that you're incorporating that timing into your cash flow projections, right? And not just dividing those items by 12, because the event is happening in April. Most likely you're not incorporating any type of, or incurring any type of expenses in September or October. You could be, depending on the type of event, but the majority of those expenses and the majority of the receipts around that event will probably be happening around the timing of that event, more or less a month or so, more or less. So really being thoughtful around, based on what is going to happen and based on how things have happened in the past, especially with government contracts. Like, if you know that this is a contract that's a late payer and will take at least 60, 90, or maybe even more days to pay, factoring that into your cash flow receipts. If it comes in sooner, great, but at least if you're being conservative up front, you have sort of you're managing your expectations in a way that is more in line with managing the risk that could be tied to those types of receipts. I think the other thing to keep in mind as it relates to revenue, especially or even expenditures, is thinking about what I call non-operating items. So this is especially important for organizations that are moving forward with any type of large scale capital project. So if you're raising money to buy a building, or if you're in the middle of a major construction project, making sure that you're reflecting not just the ins and outs tied to your program and standard operations, but the ins and outs tied to that capital project, especially with capital projects, you want to make sure that everything is on schedule, because once a project becomes delayed, almost always those costs are going to go up. So you want to get ahead of that and make sure that you're anticipating when funds and pledges are coming in, but also when you're paying for contractors or what have you related to that. The other thing to keep in mind, and this is more on the revenue side, is anything around restrictions, right? And especially if you have any type of restricted multi-year grants, you can and you should reflect the full cash once it comes in. But if you have a 2-year $100,000 grant and the foundation actually pays you that full 200, you're reflecting the receipt of the full 200, but you're also being cognizant with your teams around the expectations around that 200, which is basically that 100 of that is going to be spent next year, and that we should be setting aside that in some way, shape, or form, or planning to make sure that up that 100 is being spent down in other years. So really being cognizant of revenue restrictions is really critical especially when you're projecting revenue and the expenses tied to that revenue. And then I think at the end of the day, once you take, your first pass at cash shortages, and once you're monitoring, or cash projections rather, and you're monitoring them throughout the year, if you are projecting any cash shortages, really paying attention to, are those things that are just popping up in certain months, or are you seeing chronic cash shortages across the board? Because I think the answers to how you address those are different depending on the circumstance, right? If it's a temporary cash shortage, that could be alleviated by, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, a grant coming in or accelerating other fundraising efforts, what have you. If you're seeing shortages or pretty consistent shortages, that is really, that's more of a question around the business model, right? So are we going to have to make other adjustments to our cost structure? Are we going to have to sort of build out other revenue streams? So really figuring out, is this something are these shortages something that's temporary, or is it something that actually that is constant and therefore requires a really, thoughtful and intentional realignment of our services and our revenue strategies for sure. So as it relates to income or cash receipts, as it will usually be titled in any cash flow projection, in terms of strategies for actually managing cash flow. So let's say you've projected out over the next 12 months, this is what's coming in, this is what's coming out on a monthly basis. Throughout the year, as it relates to actually managing cash flow, really seeing and taking advantage of any opportunities there might be for advances. Those of you who have government contracts, they may not always have advances, might not always be an option for you. There are certain agencies that are more open to it than others, and it usually is something that you would have to ask for at the start of a contract. So usually it's not available once the contract is already in play and being executed. But especially on a reimbursement basis, just again, working with your funding agencies to see, is there funding that you could provide up front, especially knowing that, one, you're providing the services on a reimbursement basis, so you're having to front your own resources anyway. And like we talked a lot about this during the last session, government contracts are notorious for being late payers. And so not only are you fronting cash, it can take a long time until you get repaid for that cash. So really being intentional, and again, that doesn't necessarily need to be with government contracts only, but with any longer term grants, and especially with reimbursement based contracts, really, again, exploring the idea of advances. And even with any funding source or any grant, exploring, if you do find yourself in a situation where cash is tight, negotiating earlier receipt of pledges from individual donors, talking to program officers around the timing and schedule or payment structure. So really maximizing those opportunities based on the relationships that you have. I think the other thing to think about is, and especially if this is in the case of managing money from government contracts, or if you have other earned income from program fees that you're generating, really taking a step back and looking at your collection efforts. Are there ways that we can make our invoicing more automated? Do we need like a system like a bill.com who could either where some of these the invoicing can be a little bit more automated? Do we really need to be more intentional around monitoring income that is, 30, 60, 100 days outstanding? And what is our process for collecting those outstanding sources of revenue? So taking advantage of and making an effort to really look at what are your processes for collecting money once you've invoiced for it or once you've sent that voucher to an agency, and making sure again any all of the systems and processes around that are as sound and effective and efficient as possible. The other lever, should not too surprising, is you could raise more funds. So you could do some type of crowd raise event or some type of online donation campaign. And then I think the other piece in this last bullet is, understandably and being, very frank about the fact that that's something that will happen over time. But building reserves is a huge way to help ensure the security of cash flow. And we talked a lot about reserves in our first session together, because again, reserves are basically, especially liquid reserves, are that portion of those net assets on your balance sheet that aren't restricted, aren't tied up in some type of board designated reserve that requires board permission for use. It's really those flexible funds that are there for investing in new opportunities, or it could just be there essentially as rainy day funds that are there to ensure your ability to make payroll and cover critical costs for your organization. And so again, usually building reserves, it takes time because it usually takes years of surpluses or some type of substantial gift to help fund that. But it's basically your internal line of credit, so to speak, to help ensure that you have that funding available and have that level of security so that if something does go wrong, you have those resources available as a backup. So on the expenditure side, so thinking about cash going out, again, if you're in a situation where you're either anticipating shortages or it looks like shortages might be a possibility, again, this would have to be, and recognizably and understandably would have to be on a case by case basis, because depending on the vendor, especially, you don't want to jeopardize that relationship, and you're working with businesses who have to sustain themselves. So you want to respect and honor that, but maybe there might be an opportunity to amend a payment schedule or, break stuff up into smaller chunks of payments. So depending on this, like the importance and the strategy behind that vendor relationship, maybe exploring ideas for or methods for, can we, instead of paying it this level in this way, can we split it into 4-month chunks, or really figuring out, working with a vendor to see what's possible and what's sustainable on both ends. You could also understandably, and this might be something that is more that all of us have had to do at some point, but you might have to delay very significant expenditures outside of like core programming and operating needs like payroll. Do we have to sort of delay the launch of this product or this service, or can we, do we have to, how do we think about executing this vision within a time frame that's financially sustainable but doesn't jeopardize the integrity and impact of the service that we're providing? So just being very thoughtful about any big ticket items, and especially if a boiler breaks, or that for a facility that you own, you have to cover that, right? Because you need heat, you need hot water. But if there's, other less critical renovations, maybe we can hold off on that to give us time to generate the cash that we need for core operations. And then the other strategy that, and again, I sort of hinted at this before, is securing a line of credit or some type of bridge loan, which it's been for especially for larger organizations that have 90 to 95% government contracts. A line of credit can be your lifeblood. It's really critical because you're constantly fronting cash that is only reimbursed months, sometimes even years later. So the times to apply for a line of credit are usually well before you need one. And it's a great way to build credit history, so that as an organization, if you do move forward with larger scale efforts, like again, like purchasing a building or renovating a facility, it's a great way to prove that you're able to manage and service loans. And again, I think it's an option for organizations that really have, especially if you experience very seasonal and very significant swings in your cash flow and you don't have resources or reserves available. Lines of credit can be a great tool, or a bridge loan can be a great tool for providing that capital and then repaying it later. Again, but loans do obviously come with costs, they come with fees and interest. So thinking about that as well, because it's not free money. But again, depending on your business model and the ins and outs of your cash flow, and especially if you have a lot of government contracts, at least exploring the potential with your bank around a line of credit, what it would cost, what their conditions, or um, what types of security or collateral that they would require for those types of loans, because it can be really critical, especially if you are an organization that experiences very large swings in your cash flow throughout the year. So I've been talking a lot. Want to give us a chance to pause. If you have questions, I'm not really seeing, let me see, look through the chat right now. Not really seeing that many, but if there are questions, just want to take a minute to pause. Feel free to come off mute, or you can chat in any questions, but just want to give us a time to pause and process.
I'm sorry, I do have a question, if I may.
Sure.
I mean, and it's just as I'm slightly confused. I noticed that the name of this session is Managing Nonprofit Budgets Part 2. Is this not leveraging social media for fundraising?
No, Carlos, it's not. That actually was rescheduled. And so for that one, it's going to be later on in December.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, David here with African Connection. I do have a question.
Sure.
In terms of, I know you went through a lot, and I appreciate that. When it comes to, if you could just differentiate for us as well, the annual budget versus program budget, just to help me understand, because I'm also trying to understand the differences and how to incorporate it within my annual budget as well.
Yeah, sure. It's a great question. We talked a little bit about this in the first session, but I think it's worth talking or clarifying. So there's many types of budgets. So when we spent most of our time in the last section talking about the annual operating budget, but there's many pieces that can comprise your annual organizational budget, right? There can be program budgets, so budgets for each of the programs or departments that encompass your organization. So that's what I mean when I say program budget. You can also have a grant budget that is a budget for a specific grant or contract that you're seeking, and you can have more than one grant budget or contract budget for each of your programs, especially if you have more than one major funding source for each of your programs. The type of budget that I was just talking about is really a cash budget or cash projection. So it's taking what you're expecting on an annual basis and breaking it out into months in terms of when you're actually going to receive that money and when you're actually going to spend it. And then the other type of budget that we spend a little bit of time talking about is like a capital budget. So if you're moving forward with buying a property, for example, and securing financing for that, and then also covering costs of the architects and contract managers and all of that, then that would be something that you would want to make sure you're tracking in addition to your core operating and programmatic activity. So that, again, when I say annual budget, I'm talking about that budget that you do for your enterprise, your organization as a whole at the beginning of the year. And then a grant budget the program budget is for a specific program within your organization. And then a grant budget is for a specific funding source for one of those programs. Does that help, David?
Yes, I appreciate that. Because you actually answered my other question as well. When do you start thinking about your annual budget and your cash flow budget as well? So I appreciate that.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
So another question, and not to take up the time.
That's okay.
In terms of smaller nonprofits such as ours, what's an ideal budget look like when it comes to the cash flow? What are the key components? Because we don't have a lot of expenses, we don't have a lot of government grants, more of individual contributions.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, I think your budget, I think even regardless of your size, it should have even at a high level, it should have all of your sources of revenue. So what I'm hearing from you, David, is that your organization gets a lot of individual contributions. So that's probably where you would most likely spend the most of your time in terms of your budgeting, but also your fundraising efforts, of course. But if there are, even if they're small, if you get other sources of revenue from, I don't know, rentals or a small grant from this foundation or government agency, you do want to make sure that you're incorporating that into your budget, even if it's a small amount, just to leave room for discussions around, like, is this in terms of like a strategy around it? Do we want our grants to remain at this level, or do we want to invest in building out fundraising capacity? But basically your budget just really needs to include your revenue sources. So generally all of them, whether that's contributed income from grants and contracts, or, earned income from fee-for-service stuff, or whether it's government funded or not. And it should have your major expenses. And usually for most nonprofits, personnel is very easily anywhere between 70 to 90% of your expense base. So you want to make sure that you're leaving enough space for any type of personnel costs. So your salaries, if you have benefits, taxes tied to payroll, and then any other expenses outside of people that take up that you incur throughout the year. It could be supplies, it could be travel, it could be anything. But that's really what your budget needs to look like. And then depending on how many different programs you have, we spent a lot of the time on this in the first training about making sure that you're budgeting by program and having that roll up into your overall organizational budget. But if you're only operating one, maybe two sources, that level of detail is helpful, especially if you're a growing organization, but is not as critical for organizations that do primarily 1 to 2 types of services. If you have more than that in terms of programming, though, and especially if you have very different types of programming that you offer, being more intentional about budgeting those revenue and expense sources by program becomes even more important. But again, to answer your question, David, the budget should really just include all of the sources of your revenue, and then personnel for sure, but then outside of personnel, contractors and other supplies and resources that you're through which or how you're spending your money, basically. So as long as you're being clear around how you're making money and spending money, that's how your budget should be reflected and look like.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thanks for asking.
Hi, my name is Renee.
Hi, Renee.
My camera on so you can see me. And so I have a relatively new business. Oh,
Sure.
okay. This is me trying to turn on my camera and I'm having difficulty. I have a relatively new business, and it's about a year. I have two, a for-profit and a not-for-profit, both in mental health. And I've been funding it from the money that I've saved for my businesses, but I like the idea of building credit. And so is that something you recommend? Not actually using the money if I apply for a loan, but like paying it off. So therefore I can establish credit.
So I like the idea of building credit, but again, I think you just have to be clear, and especially in your case, Renee, who is applying? Is it you as an individual, or is it the nonprofit? Because that will change, I'm sure, whatever bank
The
you work with.
nonprofit.
Yeah. So I think what a lender is going to ask you is essentially, like, what is the loan being used for? So like, are you bridging some type of grant that's already confirmed, but you're just, it's not going to get here till July, so I need a grant or a loan to cover those shortages? if you are using
Yes.
it, if there are plans, yeah. And so if, again, especially if that source is confirmed, they'll probably ask you for the
Okay.
grant letter. I will say, again, if it's your first time applying for loans, they may go into like a little bit more specifics around, at a minimum, making sure you have this much cash in the bank every month, or that you are securing other revenue sources in case something happens to this, because they're banks, they're going to want to mitigate risk. And again, that's
Right.
not free money. So from your own planning perspectives, from the nonprofit, you need to make sure you understand their interest and fees, and that you have the resources on a monthly basis to cover that. But assuming you
Okay.
have those resources, you have a repayment source, and you understand what any of the other terms or requirements of the bank, and they're a lot, and they're really willing to move forward with it, then absolutely, like, again, having a line of credit can be, especially for a newer organization, really helpful to stem flows. But you just be careful, because I do know, especially, there's a lot of banks who require a certain level of, or number of years of operating history.
Okay.
And so that can be hard. It might be more helpful to go to like a community development finance institution, like an IFF or what, because they'll probably be a little bit more flexible in that regard. But yeah, I just understand the terms, the interest, any type of like security or collateral, if they want to make sure that you have a number of grants in your portfolio or a number of cash. But, and also just being clear and being able to communicate the story of how you're and why you're going to be using that loan capital is huge, for sure.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Of course. So I will stay on at the end of the session in case there's any other questions, but really appreciate the questions from David and Renee, and keep them coming. I'll get through some additional content, and then we can pause for some questions at the top of the hour as well. So, again, we're shifting a little bit more outside of, so we talked last session around the annual budget, the process around that. We just talked about the process of breaking down your budget in terms of timing of when that cash will come in, when the cash will go out. Now we're going to shift towards, okay, the budget's done, the cash flow projections, we have a first pass at those. Now what? And basically it's really just entering into the mode of monitoring your budget. And so I made that comment earlier around making sure you're uploading your budget to your accounting system. Within QuickBooks, you can do this. Within most standard accounting systems, you can do this. It's really important because on a monthly basis, you should be able to generate a budget versus actual report pretty quickly. And especially depending on how your accounting system is set up, and especially within QuickBooks, if you're using classes, you could do a budget versus actual for each of your programs or departments, or potentially even for your grants, if you're submitting budgets for each of those as well. But even if you just have a general budget versus actual for your organization, you're seeing, again, what you originally expected and what those original assumptions were versus what is actually happening in reality. And so the first month of your budget, there may not be that much to report back on because you just went through this exercise a month ago. But as you go through the year, things are going to change, right? And so it's really important to see what those changes are, and especially what the biggest variances are on both the revenue and the expense side. So if you are a December 31 fiscal year, or fiscal year end is December 31, and it's March, and you're significantly behind where you thought you would be for individual contributions, then that's a sign of, okay, well, what can we do to change this or mitigate this? Do we need to do more fundraising events? Do we need to change how we're doing our fundraising events? Are there certain expenditures that we need to delay while we wait for, to implement more strategies for bringing in more money? But ideally, and we talked a little bit about this during the last session, you're looking at those budget versus actuals and zeroing in on those major variances as a team. So again, like executive leadership or program leaders, and ideally the board too, you're looking at that usually on a monthly basis. The full board, maybe it's on a quarterly basis, but your whoever you consider your management team, you really want to make sure you're being diligent about looking at that on a monthly basis, because you want to leave enough time to course correct if needed, right? So if, again, in that that scenario that I just said around individual contributions. You don't want to discover in November, again, if your fiscal year is December year end, you don't want to discover in November that you're 80% behind your goal because there's not enough time to do anything about it. So the goal and the idea of monitoring your budget regularly is that it's giving you the runway and the space to make any changes necessary to either readjust and realign that goal or to execute any strategies that will put you in a better position to meet that goal. So again, the most important thing is that you're looking at the data, the budget versus the actuals, and looking at where you're most behind or even where you're most ahead, and how can you maximize that potentially in other areas, and seeing what you might have to do differently, especially is it from a risk management perspective. So we talked a little bit about this concept of reforecasting, but I want to expand up a lot more on it today. So I think as an organization, potentially you can determine what your own criteria and process is around reforecasting, but generally speaking, about 6 months into the fiscal year or halfway into the fiscal year is probably a good time to think about some type of reforecast. And it doesn't need to be as rigorous or as detailed as the process to put together your original annual operating budget for your organization. But it does give you, again, if you're doing it at the 6 month point, you have 6 months of reality that has happened. And that alone will give you a clearer picture of how you're actually going to end the year. So the original budget was useful, right? Because it gave you some additional assumptions that you were going to test. 6 months into the year, you actually have a greater capacity to see how on track those assumptions are, which ones were correct, and which ones frankly aren't. And that's okay. They're not all of the budget assumptions aren't going to be correct, right? Life happens, the external environment happens. So that reforecasting is a chance to more accurately, potentially figure out how you're going to end the year. And also, again, see what assumptions that were included in the original budget just no longer apply. And so you can think about doing that at halfway through your fiscal year. So again, if you're December year end, you would do it in June. Or if you're a junior end, you would think about doing it around the December, January timeframe. But I would highly recommend it, especially before going into your budgeting process for next year. It just gives you a clearer sense of how you're going to end the year, given that you have 6 months of realities to generate knowledge and even more informed assumptions from. You could do it either sooner or even after that 6 month mark. If you got a completely unanticipated $1 million grant, so to speak, in some type of dreamscape scenario, like your original budget just doesn't apply anymore. So reimagining what you're going to be doing for the year in those types of circumstances, or if you had some type of major expenditure that you did not anticipate, like a major, like a boiler breaks and you had to spend, $40,000 on that. Those types of circumstances can warrant reforecasting, but it's being really thoughtful around any major changes over a certain threshold. You're not going to reforecast your budget because you're $100 off. It's really thinking about, and especially if it's before mid-year. But I think at a minimum, even just taking a really hard look at your budget and seeing where the major variances are and using that as a point for reforecasting could be really helpful, because it just puts you in a much better position to more accurately anticipate where you're going to end the year, and therefore go and have even more informed assumptions going into the budgeting for next year. So again, what you're seeing on the screen is just an example of what a reforecast can look like. And again, you can format this however you want, but again, it's very much resembles just your standard operating budget. So the original budget doesn't go away. It's right here. And then with this specific sample, they budgeted both without restrictions and with restrictions. So you can see anything that may be either received or received for future years, and the amount of that's being released for the current year. But overall, again, you can still see the original budget. It's not that the original budget goes away. It's that you're taking that original budget and you're adjusting those items for which there are the most variances. So those items that are highlighted with the blue arrows are, basically where the most big, or where the focus of the reforecasting was. So this is, originally they thought they would come at 185. Maybe based on conversations with Fairweather Foundation, they're realizing that 185 is not feasible, but they're still in conversations and there's still some potential for some type of grant from this foundation. So they're budgeting at a lower amount 6 months in, or wherever this time frame is, and what have you. And so again, going through that exercise of where are we most off and why, and how should we adjust this? And again, the adjustments that you're making hopefully will help ensure that you're still able to cover your costs. If you have to incur a deficit, then again, that's not the end of the world, especially if you have reserves to cover that. But you want to do whatever you can to, at minimum, at least break even, if not achieve a surplus, which then again, in turn, creates a lot of those liquid reserves that we were talking about for the future. So again, it's not that your original budget just completely goes away. It's just that you're really focusing on and reprojecting those items, whether it's mid-year or quarter, whatever the timing is, you're reprojecting the items for which you have more insight, and those items that will have the most significant impact on your year-end results for the year. So again, it doesn't have to be a process that's as detailed and rigorous as your original budget, but it is sort of honing in on those major variances and reprojecting accordingly. So shifting a little bit away from just reforecasting and looking at scenario planning, and scenario planning can be something that can actually inform your reforecast. But when I say scenario planning, it's essentially just giving you a platform to assess what would the financial impact of different scenarios be. So like let's say we have a major grant. If we don't get this grant at this level and by this time, what would that look like? If it's behind schedule, if it's ahead of schedule, what would it look like? Or if it's just on time, and if it's at the minimum, the base case level that we projected, what would that look like? So like a best case, a worst case, and a moderate or base case scenario. And you can have you can title your scenarios whatever you want. And they can be, on the affirmative side, so getting more money than anticipated, or from a risk management perspective, like what if this actually didn't happen? What would we lose, and what would we have to do to manage risk? Again, usually I encourage organizations, if they are going to do some type of scenario planning, making sure they're restricting the scenarios to 2 to 3. You don't want to model every single thing that could happen. That's extremely time intensive, and almost you have to question the utility of that as well. I think where I found scenario planning most useful and really critical, it was especially in the early days of the pandemic, in that April through June 2020 timeframe, when we had no idea how long this was going to last and what the impact was going to be, especially like for performing arts organizations. They had to close down. So it's like, well, what is it going to, how long can we last if we are not bringing in ticket income? So this could be the base case scenario, worst case, best scenario. So it's really, I think it's really being intentional about what your biggest risks and opportunities are as an organization, and building scenarios around that. You don't want to scenario plan every little thing, or it's really just focusing on those events and those circumstances that could most significantly impact your organization. If you're looking for more resources around scenario planning, I know Bridgespring Group has a lot of helpful frameworks and tools, and the link is included on the slide. I think I like their framework because, again, there's a lot of emphasis on making sure that you understand the biggest risks to your organizations, and making sure you're mapping out what actions happen. So, right, if I lose this grant, then I'm postponing this program, I'm increasing our crowd raise fundraising by X%, what have you, and you're getting a very clear sense of when you need to execute those actions, right? And so I'll give you a sample of what the model could look like, the actual financial piece could look like, but just as important as the actual, financial modeling is making sure you're clear on the steps. And again, it's something that's iterative, right? So you're identifying the drivers, the risks, and the action items, but then you're revisiting that throughout the year, especially as you get more information and as reality plays out. So again, I think it's really the point that I want to drill down here is really being intentional about understanding the biggest risks and the opportunities and making sure that your scenarios are being used to model the impact of those major risks and opportunities. So the worksheet that I have here, it's one sample of how you can think about modeling scenarios. In this case, there's a best case, a moderate case, and a worst case. And you can find this on the Wallace Foundation's Strong Nonprofits Toolkit. This specific template focuses a lot on really solely on revenue scenarios. If expenses are more the area of unpredictability and risk, this may not be the best tool because basically you're inputting one number for expenses and you'll see the expenses stay the same throughout all of them, all of the scenarios, but you have a lot of room to play with around revenue on unpredictability in this tool. And again, it doesn't need to look exactly like this. If you want to look at this tool more, I've included the link. But again, it's ideally just a framework that allows you to see numbers side by side for each of the scenarios, just so you can see the overall impact of what these scenarios are. Because in best case, in this hypothetical example, the organization's going from a $65,000 surplus for their pre-kindergarten program to a $80,000 deficit, and so obviously that's a huge swing. And being able to anticipate that and plan ahead accordingly is obviously really huge when you're dealing with those types of swings or that level of unpredictability. And so just to sort of, I guess, round out this conversation of, I'll call them budget 2.0 exercises. This concept of multi-year projections, there may be, you very well may have found yourself in situations where either foundations have asked you for this or other types of external stakeholders have asked you for this. If you have gone through a strategic plan, then especially a multi-year strategic plan, these are usually a great tool to help map out the financial implications and requirements of it. So absolutely would encourage, if you have executed or in the process of developing a multi-year strategic plan, multi-year budgeting is a very useful and timely tool. It can also be useful for potentially for if you are going through major changes again, if you're growing as an organization or are making major changes to how you deliver programming and changes that can't just happen in 1 year and will take many years to happen. Multi-year projections are, again, a good roadmap for how to think about executing it over multi-year. And it is something that can inform budgeting for the future. It may not necessarily replace your annual operating budgeting process because that's usually a little bit more detailed, where multi-year projections are a little bit more high level, but it's something that in future years can help inform how you're thinking about your business model and your major drivers of revenue and expense. Looking at a question, budget revisions are always an option, correct? Yeah, I mean, I think it depends what budget you're talking about. If you're talking about a program, or if you're talking about a grant or contract revision, then you would have to comply with whatever the standards are for your funding agency. But I think particularly in the context of government contracts, really being diligent about monitoring them on a monthly basis and exploring the option for budget modifications where there are some, so that you're just not leaving money on the table, right? Because if you get to a mid-year and you were supposed to do this level of service delivery, but you couldn't because you didn't have the staff to do it, talking to your funding agency saying, hey, can we think about reimagining the schedule of that programming? Can we push some of this into next fiscal year? And those types of budget modifications sometimes are available and can be hugely critical just to make sure you're not leaving money on the table. So budget revisions as an organization, always possible because you're driving that. But in terms of if it's budget revisions for a specific contract or grant, talk with if it's a foundation program officer, if it's a government agency, whoever your main contacts are, and seeing what's possible there and making sure you're complying with their process. Thanks for the question. So in terms of multi-year budgeting, again, I think it's very important for organizations that are going through some type of inflection point as it relates to setting your strategy going forward. So what you're looking at here is, and this is a way again to get some of the strategic clarity that you would do before you start your budgeting, is it's called the money mission matrix. I think Steve Zimmerman was the man who pioneered it. He has his own consulting he's done a lot of work with Nonprofit Quarterly and groups like Blue Avocado who provide services and tools and templates for nonprofits. But basically it's basically giving you an opportunity to look at all of your programs, look not just at their profitability. So programs that are closer to the right are more profitable. Programs that are closer to the left on the x-axis are less profitable, but also looking at your impact. And there could be many ways that you could score this. If you research or Google Money Mission Matrix, you should be able to see what other people have done in terms of scoring impact. So community relevance, geographic reach, whatever criteria you want to use and apply a numerical value to it is a way to assess impact. So programs that are higher on this matrix are rated at a higher level of impact. Programs that are lower are a lower level. And so basically mapping out your programs and seeing how can we get either more of our programs here, or if there are these programs, these heart programs that are critical to our identity, but aren't necessarily able to cover their costs, what other stuff can we do on the right side to make sure that we're covering and subsidizing those programs? So really, before you're going through any of these, or any budgeting really, but especially multi-year modeling, making sure you're taking the chance to look at your programs and map them accordingly, and then use the projections to as a tool for executing that strategy. So it's a lot, establishing assumptions, running the numbers, and acting and monitoring. Those are things that you essentially already do as part of your annual operating budget. I think when you're doing multi-year budgeting, though, it puts that much more emphasis on getting to strategic clarity around how do I get more of my programs here, or how do I subsidize the programs that are over here with the activities that are generating more money. And potentially may still be mission critical as well, but really getting the right mix of your programs and where they sit here. And then finally, again, this is very much a hypothetical, just to give a sense of making multi-year planning less abstract. Here's a sample of how it might look for you. Again, to our point around what a budget should include, even on a multi-year level, you're including your major revenue sources and your expenses. Typically, and you can have backup tabs for each of your programs that feed into a summary that might look like this. It can look however way you want, but basically you're able to see on some level the financial input. So revenue and expenses, surplus, deficit on a multi-year basis, right? And so again, in this scenario, the first year of the plan, they have a deficit. Things start evening out towards the end of the plan as they sort of invest in more staff, generate more fundraising activity, what have you. But it's a great way to make sure, especially if you have a strategic plan, making sure that it's not just a nice glossy document that sits on your hard drive or sits on a shelf. You actually have a plan for executing it and a financial roadmap for how to execute it over time. So that's all I got. I will stay on for any questions folks have, but Anna, is there anything that you want to wrap up with before we close out?
No, thank you so much. This was so much information, Dana. I appreciate you so much. And I'm sure that everyone in the chat too. I definitely want to leave some time for any other questions that come up, but just know that look forward to hearing more about our 2024 programming here at AMPT. And I know that there are other opportunities for capacity building coming up through Greater Auburn Gresham Development Corporation and other organizations as well. So thank you all for joining us.
Yes. And I didn't